The first sound didn't come from the machine. It came from the man who stopped walking. At 5:18 on a cold Monday morning, while the factory was still waking beneath rows of fluorescent lights, Elias Mercer paused halfway across the forging hall. Forklifts hummed through narrow lanes. Overhead cranes groaned as they carried steel billets toward the furnaces, and the familiar heartbeat of Press Line 3 rolled through the building in slow, thunderous pulses. To everyone else, everything sounded normal. To Elias, one note was missing. He stood motionless for a moment, lunch pail hanging from one hand, his faded maintenance jacket zipped to his chin against the lingering chill that always settled inside the plant before the furnaces reached full temperature. A younger electrician brushed past him with a cheerful nod. "Morning, Eli." Elias answered automatically, but never took his eyes off the press. After 41 years inside Ashcroft Industrial Components, his mornings followed almost the same path. He arrived before sunrise, poured coffee into the same dented steel mug he'd carried for years, checked overnight maintenance reports, and then walked every production line before anyone asked him to. The walk wasn't part of his official duties anymore. Nobody had told him to stop. Nobody had thought to ask why he still did it. He simply believed machines deserved a greeting before they were expected to carry another day's burden. He crossed the polished concrete floor worn smooth by decades of heavy boots until he reached the enormous hydraulic forging press. It towered over him like a steel cathedral, its massive frame disappearing into the ceiling trusses. Every few seconds, the ram descended with measured force, shaping glowing metal into precision components destined for construction equipment around the world. The vibration reached through the soles of his boots. He frowned, not because it was loud, because it hesitated, just for the briefest instant, almost too subtle to notice. Almost. Elias rested 2 fingers against the side of the machine's housing. His eyes closed. Nearby, coolant hissed over fresh forgings. Pneumatic tools rattled from an assembly station. A warning horn echoed as another overhead crane began moving across the bay. He ignored all of it. Instead, he counted the rhythm. 1, 2, 3, then, there, a tiny flutter between hydraulic cycles. Not a bang, not a scrape, not even what most people would call a noise. More like the machine had briefly forgotten its own breathing pattern. His fingers remained against the steel another minute before he stepped back. "You talking to it again?" The voice belonged to Marcus Delgado, a maintenance mechanic barely 30 years old, carrying a tablet tucked beneath one arm. Elias smiled without embarrassment. "Listening." Marcus chuckled. "And what did it say?" "Not sure yet." Marcus glanced toward the press. "Everything's green." He tilted the tablet toward Elias. Every indicator glowed comfortably within operating limits. Hydraulic pressure, normal. Bearing temperature, normal. Cycle efficiency, normal. No vibration alerts, no anomalies. Marcus shrugged. "Looks happy to me." "It usually does. You think something's wrong?" "I think something's changing." Marcus looked at the giant press again, trying to hear whatever Elias had heard. After several seconds, he shook his head. "I don't hear anything." "You probably shouldn't." Marcus laughed. "That's reassuring. It isn't meant to be." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Around them, the factory slowly filled with more workers. Boots echoed across the floor. Radios crackled with shift assignments. The smell of warm hydraulic oil, mixed with fresh coffee, drifting from the break room. Marcus broke the silence. "You gonna log an inspection?" Elias hesitated. He disliked creating unnecessary work. Production schedules were already tight. Every inspection delayed someone else's deadline. But ignoring a feeling simply because it wasn't convenient had never sat well with him. "I'll take another look after first shift starts." Marcus nodded. "If anyone can hear trouble before the computers do, it's you." Elias smiled politely, though the compliment made him uncomfortable. Machines weren't magical. They were honest. If you spent enough years paying attention, eventually they stopped surprising you. At least that had always been true before. 2 floors above the production hall, sunlight began filtering through the glass walls of the executive conference room. Nathan Brooks stood before a digital presentation displaying quarterly production targets. At 38, he was the youngest CEO in the company's history. His dark suit looked almost out of place against charts filled with steel output and equipment utilization rates. 3 months earlier, Investors had hired him to modernize Ashcroft Industrial Components after years of shrinking profits and increasing overseas competition. Nathan hadn't come from manufacturing. He came from operational analytics. He believed factories should be measurable, predictable, efficient. His presentation reflected exactly that. "We've reduced unscheduled downtime by 18%, he said, clicking to the next slide. "Predictive maintenance software now monitors every critical asset in real time." Several board members exchanged approving glances. Nathan continued. "The goal isn't simply to repair equipment faster." He pointed toward another graph. "It's to eliminate uncertainty entirely." Down below, thousands of tons of machinery continued moving beneath his feet. He barely noticed. By mid-morning, the forging hall had settled into its familiar rhythm. Heat shimmered above furnace doors. Chains clinked overhead. Freshly forged components rolled across conveyors toward machining cells. Elias carried a handheld vibration meter to press line 3, more to satisfy procedure than expectation. The readings matched the computer system almost perfectly, within tolerance, exactly as Marcus's tablet had shown. He frowned anyway. Numbers weren't lying, they simply weren't telling the whole story. He knelt beside an access panel, shining a flashlight across hydraulic fittings. Nothing leaked, no unusual wear, no loose fasteners. Everything appeared almost pristine. Almost. Near the rear manifold, he noticed a faint amber stain no larger than a fingerprint. Not fresh oil, older, oxidized. He gently rubbed it with a clean cloth. The stain disappeared. Yet something about its location bothered him. It didn't belong there. Not after all these years. He stared at the manifold longer than he intended. A memory tugged at him, but refused to fully surface. Someone called his name. Elias. Maintenance supervisor Linda Harper approached, clipboard tucked beneath one arm. "You wanted an inspection request? I'd like to schedule a controlled shutdown on line 3. Linda raised an eyebrow. "Reason?" "I've got an irregular hydraulic pulse. Sensor readings? They're normal." She waited. "And? I still think we should inspect it." Linda sighed. "You know what production's like this week." "I do. We're already behind on 2 export orders." "I know." She looked toward the press. "If diagnostics aren't showing anything, operations won't approve downtime." "I'm aware. Then why ask?" Elias searched for words. "Because the machine feels different. Because something is remembering how to fail. Because experience doesn't always fit into a report." None of those sounded convincing. Finally, he answered quietly. "Because I'd rather interrupt production for 2 hours than explain an accident for 2 years. Linda looked at him for a long moment. She respected Elias. Everyone did, but respect wasn't authority. "I'll submit it," she said. "No promises. That's all I'm asking." The request reached the executive offices just after lunch. Nathan reviewed it between budget meetings. Requested downtime, 2 hours. Reason, possible hydraulic irregularity. Supporting diagnostic data, none. He leaned back in his chair. His operations director stood nearby. "Thoughts?" Nathan asked. "No system alerts. No history? Nothing current." Nathan tapped the report thoughtfully. "The technician requesting it. Elias Mercer. The veteran?" "The same." Nathan had heard the name before. Every factory seemed to have someone whose reputation bordered on legend. Usually deserved. Sometimes exaggerated. "He believes something's off," the director said carefully. Nathan nodded. "I'm sure he does." He looked again at the maintenance dashboard displayed on the wall. Every indicator remained green. Every performance metric exceeded expectations. Finally, he signed the decision. Inspection denied. Continue monitoring. Let the maintenance team know we'll reassess if the data changes. The director nodded and left. Nathan returned to preparing for the upcoming investor tour. He never considered the request again. Near the end of the shift, Linda found Elias tightening bolts on a conveyor guard. They turned it down. He simply nodded. "I figured." "I'm sorry." "No need." Elias wiped grease from his hands with an old cotton rag. "The system's doing exactly what it was designed to do." "You don't agree?" He looked across the factory toward the towering press. "I think it's answering a different question." Linda followed his gaze. "What are you going to do?" Elias smiled faintly. "The same thing I always do." "And what's that?" "Keep listening." When the evening shift finally arrived, most workers headed home without another thought. But Elias walked toward an old maintenance office tucked behind a row of unused storage racks. Dust coated the windows. Inside, filing cabinets stood untouched, survivors from a time before every repair became a digital record. He unlocked the cabinet with a small brass key he'd carried for years. Inside were faded binders, handwritten diagrams, coffee-stained notebooks, and incident reports older than many of the workers now filling the factory floor. He wasn't searching for a specific file, only a memory. As he turned another yellowed page, one date stopped him cold, 27 years earlier. The report described unusual hydraulic pulses and a custom-machined replacement manifold installed after an accident almost everyone had forgotten. His heartbeat slowed. He flipped to the next page. The report ended in the middle of a sentence. The remaining pages were gone. Morning rain drummed softly against the factory skylights, turning the first light of day into a dull gray glow that stretched across the production floor. Inside Ashcroft Industrial Components, however, nothing slowed down. Furnaces roared, conveyors rattled. The massive forging press continued its steady cycle, each downward stroke sending a familiar tremor through the concrete. To most of the workforce, it sounded exactly as it had the day before. To Elias Mercer, the rhythm had changed again. Not dramatically, just enough to make him uncomfortable. He stood near the safety railing overlooking Press Line 3, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. His eyes weren't on the moving ram, but on the workers around it. They trusted the machine without thinking about it. Most of them had never seen a serious equipment failure. He hoped they never would. Marcus walked up beside him, rubbing sleep from his eyes after covering an overnight maintenance call. "You stayed late yesterday?" Elias nodded. "Found anything?" "Maybe." "That's not very convincing. It isn't convincing to me yet either." Marcus leaned against the railing. "You still thinking about that old report?" "I found the first half. And? The second half's missing." Marcus shrugged. "Maybe somebody tossed it years ago." "Maybe." But Elias didn't believe that. Factories rarely threw away documents after serious accidents. They misplaced them, filed them under the wrong machine, stuffed them into binders that nobody opened for decades. Somewhere the rest of that report still existed. He could feel it. At 9 o'clock, the executive conference room buzzed with polite conversation as investors arrived for their quarterly tour. Nathan Brooks greeted each visitor confidently. Behind him, a large screen displayed charts filled with rising productivity, lower maintenance costs, and improved delivery times. "Our modernization program is ahead of schedule," Nathan explained. "We've integrated predictive monitoring across every critical production system. Instead of reacting to failures, we identify problems before they happen." One investor smiled. "So downtime should become increasingly rare." "That's the goal." Nathan believed it. The software collected millions of data points every hour. Temperatures, pressures, motor loads, vibration frequencies, information no human being could possibly track alone. It wasn't replacing experience. It was making experience measurable, or so he thought. Back on the production floor, Elias requested permission to inspect the rear hydraulic access compartment during the lunch changeover. Linda Harper met him beside the press. "You've got 15 minutes. That's enough." The machine powered down briefly as operators switched material batches. Elias removed the inspection panel and climbed carefully inside the maintenance space. The compartment was warm, smelling faintly of hydraulic oil and heated steel. Thick hoses snaked through narrow openings. The pressure balancing assembly sat partially hidden behind support braces installed decades earlier. He ran a flashlight across the components. Everything looked remarkably clean. Too clean. One polished section of steel reflected the beam differently than the surrounding metal. He knelt closer. A hairline scrape, barely visible. Fresh. Someone else might have mistaken it for routine wear. Elias touched it gently. The edge felt sharp. His expression tightened. The balancing assembly wasn't supposed to move enough to create that mark. Not unless... He stopped the thought before finishing it. Linda glanced inside. "See something?" "I'm not ready to answer that. You're starting to worry me. I was worried yesterday." They reassembled the access panel before production resumed. The press came back to life. Boom, pause, boom, pause. That tiny hesitation was still there. Later that afternoon, Elias climbed the narrow metal stairs leading to the forgotten records room above the original machine shop. Dust floated through thin beams of sunlight, cutting between broken blinds. Shelves leaned beneath decades of binders, labeled in fading handwriting. Many documented equipment that no longer existed. Others belonged to retired technicians whose names had slowly disappeared from company memory. He worked methodically, not by machine number, by year. Factories remembered time better than they remembered people. He opened another binder. Routine inspections. Another. Lubrication schedules. Another. Emergency repairs. Hours slipped past unnoticed. Outside, thunder rolled across the sky. Rain intensified against the roof. Just as he considered giving up, a folded maintenance bulletin slipped from the pages of an unrelated electrical manual. It landed at his feet. He unfolded it carefully. Attached behind it, 3 missing pages. His breathing slowed. The paper had yellowed with age, but the handwriting remained perfectly readable. His own. For several seconds, he simply stared. He had forgotten writing it. 30 years earlier, after a hydraulic failure nearly caused a fatal accident, he had spent weeks documenting every observation while the memories were still fresh. His younger handwriting carried an urgency he could still recognize. Do not rely solely on pressure readings. The earliest warning is not measurable through standard vibration sensors. Operators may notice nothing unusual. Experienced maintenance personnel should listen for irregular hydraulic cadence during unloaded cycles. Elias swallowed hard. The next paragraph described something he had almost forgotten entirely. After the accident, replacement parts from the original manufacturer would have taken nearly 6 months to arrive. The factory couldn't survive that delay. So the night shift machinists built a replacement manifold themselves. It wasn't an improvised repair. It was masterful craftsmanship. But it behaved differently from the original design. Slightly differently. Enough that standard engineering assumptions no longer fully applied. The document ended with a handwritten note. If these warning signs ever return, don't assume the records will remember what people forget. Elias closed his eyes. He remembered writing those words after watching 2 co-workers carried away on stretchers. Both had survived. Barely. He had promised himself no future technician would have to learn the same lesson the hard way. Yet somehow, over the years, that promise had faded into routine. Until now. That evening, instead of filing another maintenance request, Elias asked Linda for 5 minutes with Nathan Brooks. She looked doubtful. I can ask. That's all I need. To her surprise, Nathan agreed. They met in a glass conference room overlooking the production hall. Below them, hundreds of employees continued working beneath bright industrial lights. Nathan gestured toward a chair. I've heard good things about you, Mr. Mercer. I'd rather you hear this. Elias placed the Warren incident report on the table. Nathan glanced at the faded pages. I understand you're concerned about line 3. I am. Our monitoring system still shows no critical abnormalities. I know. Nathan folded his hands. Help me understand. For a moment, Elias searched for the right words. Finally, he spoke quietly. When I started here, every machine had its own personality. Nathan smiled politely. I'm not sure machines have personalities. They do after 40 years. Nathan remained silent. Elias continued. They've been repaired by different hands. Parts have been modified. Bearings wear differently. Foundations settle. Welds age. None of that's wrong. It's simply history. Nathan looked toward the bustling factory below. And you're saying the software can't see that history? I'm saying the software only knows what someone taught it to measure. Nathan considered the answer. The data doesn't support shutting down our highest producing line. No. So what should I base the decision on? Elias looked through the glass toward the distant forging press. On the possibility that the data isn't asking the right question. The room fell quiet. Not awkwardly. Thoughtfully. Nathan finally stood. I appreciate your honesty. Elias could already hear the decision before it came, but I can't justify stopping production without measurable evidence. He wasn't dismissive. He wasn't arrogant. He was carrying responsibilities Elias understood all too well. Investors, payroll, contracts, thousands of families depending on the factory. Elias nodded. I understand. As he reached the door, Nathan spoke again. For what it's worth, I hope you're wrong. So do I. Near midnight, the day shift was long gone. Only the overnight crew remained. Rain had finally stopped, leaving the factory strangely quiet between production cycles. Marcus stood near line 3, checking lubrication levels, when he heard something unusual. The familiar hydraulic rhythm skipped a beat, then corrected itself. He looked toward the press. For the first time, He heard exactly what Elias had been trying to describe, a tiny hesitation, almost like the machine had taken a cautious breath before continuing. Marcus slowly reached for his radio. Before he could speak, the vibration changed. Once, twice. Then, without warning, every light on the production line flickered. The thunder of the forging press stopped mid-cycle. Silence swept across the factory. Not because power had failed, because the machine had shut itself down. For a heartbeat, the factory seemed to forget how to breathe. The familiar thunder of Press Line 3 had been part of the building's life for decades. Without it, every other sound suddenly became noticeable. The distant hiss of steam, the ticking of cooling metal, the slow spin of ventilation fans high above the production floor. Workers stopped, not because someone shouted, but because silence itself felt unfamiliar. Marcus stared at the frozen forging press. The emergency status light glowed amber instead of red. That puzzled him. If the machine believed it had suffered a catastrophic failure, alarms would already be screaming. Instead, it was waiting. Within seconds, radios crackled across the plant. Maintenance to Line 3. Operations to Line 3. Safety team responding. Boots echoed across the concrete as supervisors hurried toward the press from every direction. Elias was already walking there, not running. Walking with the calm urgency of someone who had learned long ago that panic rarely solved mechanical problems. Linda Harper reached him halfway across the floor. "They're saying the automatic protection system shut it down." "It should have. You expected this? I hoped I'd be wrong." They arrived together. Operators stood behind safety barriers while electricians isolated the power systems. Hydraulic technicians checked pressure gauges that now rested at 0. The massive steel ram remained suspended halfway through its cycle, as if frozen in time. Nathan Brooks arrived moments later, still wearing the suit from a late-night meeting with overseas clients. His polished shoes collected a thin layer of gray dust as he crossed the factory floor. He looked from the silent machine to the gathered employees. "What happened?" "No injuries," Linda answered first. "The safety system stopped the cycle." Nathan nodded once, relieved. "Cause?" Nobody answered. Not yet. The inspection began before sunrise. Access panels were removed one by one. Work lights illuminated spaces that normally remained hidden behind thick steel covers. The atmosphere was strangely quiet. Nobody joked. Nobody rushed. Even experienced mechanics understood that careful work mattered more than fast work. Elias climbed inside the rear maintenance compartment, with Marcus beside him. "Flashlight," Elias said. Marcus handed it over. The bright beam swept slowly across hydraulic lines before settling on the pressure balancing assembly. "There." Marcus leaned closer. "What am I looking at?" Elias pointed toward a polished steel collar surrounding the custom manifold. At first glance, nothing seemed unusual. Then Marcus noticed it. A gap, barely wider than a credit card. It shouldn't have existed. The assembly shifted, Marcus whispered. "About 3 millimeters." "That's enough?" Elias nodded. "More than enough." They measured the movement twice. The numbers matched. 3 millimeters. Almost impossible to notice. Almost impossible to predict through conventional monitoring. Yet under full production loads, those 3 millimeters allowed hydraulic pressure to distribute unevenly through the aging manifold. Another few hundred production cycles, perhaps another day, maybe only a few more hours. The stress would likely have fractured the custom-machined housing. If that happened under full operating pressure, thousands of pounds of hydraulic force could have been released in an instant. Not an explosion, something worse, a violent mechanical failure capable of turning heavy steel components into deadly projectiles. The automatic shutdown hadn't interrupted production. It had interrupted disaster. Nathan listened without interrupting as the engineering team reviewed the findings. One engineer frowned at the maintenance drawings. "These dimensions don't match the original manufacturer specifications." "They don't," Elias replied. "Why? Because it isn't the original manifold." The room grew quiet. Nathan looked up. "What do you mean?" Elias placed the faded incident report beside the engineering diagrams. 27 years ago, the original housing cracked after a pressure imbalance. "I never saw that report." "You couldn't have. It wasn't digitized?" "Only the first page." Nathan looked confused. "What happened to the rest?" "It ended up inside the wrong equipment binder." The younger engineers exchanged surprised glances. One of them asked quietly, "So, We've been maintaining this machine using the wrong documentation? Not wrong, Elias answered. Incomplete. He unfolded an old black and white photograph from inside the folder. It showed 6 machinists standing beside a newly finished steel manifold. Their clothes were covered in grease. Their faces looked exhausted. But every one of them was smiling. We built this ourselves. Nathan studied the picture. You? Elias nodded. We worked 3 nights without going home. Why not wait for the replacement part? Because waiting 6 months would have closed the factory. The room fell silent again. This time, the silence carried a different weight. The engineers weren't looking at outdated paperwork anymore. They were looking at living history. Repairs took 4 days. Production losses were significant. Executives prepared difficult conversations with customers. Investors questioned why an unverified concern had almost become a crisis. Nathan answered every meeting with complete honesty. We relied on accurate data. He paused before continuing. The mistake was believing accurate data meant complete information. Some investors disliked that answer. Others respected it. Nathan no longer cared which. A week later, he found Elias sitting alone in the cafeteria before sunrise, eating oatmeal from the same blue thermos he'd carried for years. Nathan asked, "Mind if I sit?" Elias looked surprised. "It's a free chair." For a minute, neither man spoke. Workers drifted in and out around them. Coffee machines hissed. Morning announcements echoed faintly through ceiling speakers. Finally, Nathan broke the silence. "I owe you an apology." Elias shook his head. "No. I ignored your recommendation. You made the best decision you could with what you believed." Nathan looked down at his coffee. "I kept thinking about something you said." "What was that?" "The software only knows what someone teaches it to measure." Elias smiled faintly. "I've been wrong before too." Nathan looked up. "You have?" "More times than I'd like." "What made the difference?" I tried to remember why. Nathan laughed quietly. "That's not a very executive answer." "No. It's a technician's answer." Both men smiled. The conversation felt less like reconciliation and more like 2 professionals finally speaking the same language. Over the following months, changes spread through Ashcroft Industrial Components. Not dramatic changes. Thoughtful ones. Every veteran technician was paired with a younger engineer. Old handwritten notebooks were scanned, cataloged, and discussed, not simply archived. Monthly meetings no longer focused only on performance metrics. They also included something new: stories, unusual repairs, mistakes, near misses, lessons that never appeared in manuals. Nathan insisted every undocumented modification inside the factory be inspected, photographed, and explained. Some employees wondered whether the effort was worth the time. Then they discovered dozens of custom-built solutions that had quietly kept the factory running for decades. Knowledge hidden in plain sight. Autumn arrived. Golden leaves collected outside loading docks as cool air replaced the heat of summer. Inside the plant, Press Line 3 operated with a newly manufactured balancing assembly designed using both modern engineering analysis and the original machinist's handwritten notes. Its rhythm sounded different, healthier. Marcus noticed it immediately. One morning, while walking his inspection route, he stopped beside the machine. He rested 2 fingers lightly against the steel housing. He closed his eyes, listened. Only after a few moments did he glance at his tablet. Everything matched. Behind him, Elias happened to be passing through the aisle, carrying an empty toolbox. He paused just long enough to notice Marcus smiling to himself. "You hear anything?" Elias asked. Marcus opened one eye. "Just making sure." Elias nodded. "Good habit." He continued walking. At the end of the shift, employees gathered near the main entrance for a small retirement ceremony. There was no stage, no elaborate speeches, just coworkers, coffee and paper cups, and a simple plaque thanking Elias for 41 years of service. When Nathan stepped forward, everyone expected a formal address. Instead, he held up the old incident report. This, he said quietly, saved more than a production line. He looked toward the crowd of mechanics, operators, engineers, electricians, and apprentices. It reminded us that a factory isn't only built from steel, software, and schedules. He glanced at Elias. It's also built from people willing to notice what others overlook, and willing to teach before that knowledge disappears. The applause that followed wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was steady, sincere, the kind of respect that couldn't be printed on a certificate. Later that afternoon, after everyone had gone back to work, Elias walked once more through the forging hall. The presses thundered in their familiar rhythm. Forklifts moved between rows of finished components. The smell of warm steel and machine oil filled the air, just as it had on his first day more than 4 decades earlier. He reached the exit door and looked back one last time. Marcus was already leading a young apprentice toward press line 3. The apprentice placed 2 fingers against the steel housing before checking the digital diagnostics. Not because anyone had instructed him to, because someone had shown him that experience and technology were strongest when they listened to each other. Elias smiled to himself, pushed open the heavy factory door, and stepped into the cool morning air. Behind him, the machines kept working, not because one old technician had saved them, but because the wisdom of a lifetime had finally found its way into the future.